Well, China closes out this decade as an undisputed economic powerhouse, but it faces plenty of challenges ahead, and the World Economic Forum has called our next guest one of China's leading foreign-born scholars. He's Joshua Cooper Ramo. We should note, divides his time between here in New York and Beijing. He's a managing director of Kissinger Associates, though, and you're an aerobatic plane. I mean, what do you call it?
Pilot.
Competitive aerobatic plane. You still pilot?
Yes, yeah, I'd still be a pilot.
But what's aerobatic? But you do tricks and whatnot?
Yes, like stunt flying.
Okay.
Yeah.
How does that relate to the job that you do every day in terms of finding out strategy?
Well, you know, I guess it does prepare you for life in China because it's always hard to know which direction you're going. China's a place that's changing so quickly that almost by definition, the ideas that you use a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago don't work anymore. So you're constantly having to reorient yourself, and if you're not paying attention, you can end up in some uncomfortable positions.
Well, we are trying to orient ourselves a little bit here, coming up at the end of 2009 and looking at the decade to come. With any kind of political, economic, financial trend, China keeps emerging as the potential game changer for the consumer, for financial investment for you. What is China going to look like in the decade to come?
Well, I think your point is a very good one, which is no matter what you think about, China touches it, whether it's energy, commodities markets, consumer, American debt. China is everywhere. It's omnipresent. I think that's going to be a growing fact of our lives. Two things are going to drive that. First of all, the nature of the Chinese economy itself is changing. This year we celebrate 30 years of what the Chinese call reform and opening. And the virtue of that process is kind of fundamentally remade the Chinese economy. It's made it more global. It's made it more sophisticated. That means it's going to be more enmeshed with global economics, which means it'll touch American lives much more.
When we hear about China, though, the topic of, as you mentioned, the amount of U.S. debt that they hold keeps resurfacing as potentially not just being a financial issue, but potentially a threatening one on the political front.
I think it's already a political issue. I mean, the fact is you can't hold $2 trillion worth of American currency reserves and not have it be political to some degree. You know, in all honesty, I think the Chinese ended up with a much larger chunk of American debt than they intended. I think it was an artifact of some policies designed to protect their domestic industry. How they manage that transition going forward, though, is very important to the U.S. macroeconomy. We need the Chinese to continue to buy our debt to support us, but at the same time, that's not really a long-term, healthy relationship. So as you talk about a 10-year time horizon, that's got to be something that resolves itself one way or another.
Are they still going to be the biggest or one of the biggest holders of debt?
They will be. I mean, you have to remember that for the Chinese, the most important thing is creating a stable international environment for growth. It's a country that's lifted 400 million people out of poverty in the last 20 years, but also has 300 million people living on less than $4 a day. And so they have a long way left to go in economic development. They don't want a lot of global turbulence, and to that degree, they think helping support the United States actually makes a little bit of sense.
It's interesting when you're talking about living in Beijing and knowing the people on the ground and the decision makers there. When I'm reading through your notes, you highlighted the idea that in 1980, when reform began, the level of Chinese officials in the provinces were at the 5th grade level. Now they're at the PhD level. Short amount of time, tremendous amount of progress on that front. What kind of progress, when you have that kind of trajectory,
where do you go next, right?
Exactly.
You can't really,
I mean,
a lot of people talk about this,
that
the Communist Party has just changed so quickly. People sometimes say, oh, there hasn't been any political reform in China in the last 30 years. But you wouldn't have the kind of economic reform you had if there hasn't been some underlying shift in politics. The challenge now is that as the society gets more complicated, as the demands of ordinary Chinese get more difficult to meet, the party itself has to adjust yet again. And I don't think we know the answer to that question. I think in 1980, Deng Xiaoping could sit down and say, these people have 5th grade educations, let's get some people in there with PhDs. Today, it's much less simple.
Does that mean a certain level of instability at home?
Yeah, I mean, the great paradox of life in China today is the one thing Chinese people want the most, which is stability, is the one thing they can't have. Country's got to urbanize, for instance, 300 million people in the next 15 years. It's going to be tremendously destabilizing, but it's essential for the future of economic growth.
The potential of China continues to dominate here in the decade to come.
Yeah, I think so.
But perhaps we'll start to see it no longer be potential. It'll just be basically what's dominating the agenda here. Thank you so much, Joshua.